Ladies and gentlemen, when we gaze back at the dawn of human history, we find not only temples and myths, but also a profound reflection of the human soul. The ancient gods were never simply fictions of a primitive imagination. They were living realities erupting from the depths of the psyche, clothed in the forms of myth and ritual. Even now, though we may think ourselves modern and enlightened, these same powers stir within us, guiding our dreams, shaping our desires, and troubling our conscience. The gods of antiquity did not descend from the heavens as arbitrary inventions of the human mind, nor were they born of idle fancy. They emerged rather as spontaneous manifestations of the psychic depths, as forms shaped in the crucible of the collective unconscious. These figures, clothed in myth and ritual, are expressions of something timeless, something within us that surpasses mere personal experience. They represent the primordial forces that govern human life, the storm of desire, the weight of fate, the tenderness of love, the cruelty of destruction, and the silent mystery of death. What the ancients perceived as gods were projections of inner powers, archetypal patterns that still move within our own souls. When one contemplates the great pantheons, Greek, Egyptian, Hindu, or Norse, one discovers striking similarities. The thunderer appears again and again. Zeus, Indra, Thor, the mother of fertility and nourishment, reappears in endless guises. Demeter, Isis, Shakti, the dark trickster, the playful and destructive spirit, echoes in Loki, Hermes, and countless others. These repetitions cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. They testify to the presence of universal structures, archetypes that compel representation, erupting again and again in diverse cultures and epochs. Humanity, in its attempt to give form to the inexpressible, clothed these inner realities in divine figures. The archaic mind did not perceive these gods as metaphors. They were experienced directly, with an immediacy that we, in our rational age, can scarcely imagine. When the storm raged and lightning split the night sky, it was not merely an atmospheric phenomenon. It was the hand of Zeus or Thor, the living presence of a divine power. This perception was not error, but a natural projection of the psyche upon the world. For the human being, confronted with the overwhelming forces of nature and of his own inner life, could not yet distinguish between the external event and the inner archetypal resonance. The storm outside awakened the storm within, and the two became inseparable. Thus divinity was born in the fusion of outer event and inner experience. To reduce these gods to mere allegory would be to impoverish them. They are more than symbols in the narrow sense. They are living psychic realities. They appear in dreams, in visions, in the sudden compulsion of emotion. They seize us with awe, terror, or ecstasy, as if something greater than ourselves has taken hold. The ancients named these powers and bowed before them. We in our modernity often repress them, only to find them returning in disguised forms, sessions, compulsions, collective movements, and myths dressed in political or technological clothing. The gods have not vanished, they have merely altered their garments. One may say that these archetypal roots of divinity serve a psychological function of orientation. They provide images through which the human being encounters and interprets the mystery of existence. Without them, the psyche would drown in the formless flood of instinct and raw experience. Archetypes crystallize chaos into form. They give shape to love through the figure of Aphrodite, to war through Ares, to wisdom through Athena. In this way, the psyche externalizes its inner structures, granting human beings a language for forces too vast to be contained by reason alone. It is of great importance to recognize that these figures are not bound to antiquity. They continue to stir within the unconscious of modern man. The longing for transcendence, the battle with inner demons, the yearning for a guiding light, these experiences remain. Though we no longer raise temples to Apollo, the search for clarity, reason, and illumination still shapes our striving. Though we no longer invoke Dionysus by name, the intoxication of ecstasy and the dissolution of boundaries still surge in music halls, festivals, and frenzied movements of collective life. The gods have withdrawn into the psyche, but they have not died. If one dares to look inward, one may still encounter these primordial images. They may appear in the dream as a wise old man, a radiant maiden, a monstrous devourer, or a numinous figure cloaked in light. They may announce themselves in sudden moods, in inspirations, in the voice of conscience, or in the shadowy impulses one would rather deny. To engage with them consciously is to begin a dialogue with the deepest layers of the soul. To ignore them is to risk being possessed by them unconsciously. Thus, the roots of divinity lie not in the heavens above, but in the depths within. The gods are the language of the soul, its attempt to articulate the eternal forces that shape our destiny. To recognize this is not to diminish their grandeur, but to encounter them anew not as distant myths, but as living presences within the fabric of our being. In honoring them, we honor the truth of our own depths, and we take a step toward the integration of the fragmented self. Myth speaks to us in a language that is older than words, a language woven of images, symbols, and timeless patterns. It does not merely tell us stories of gods, heroes, and monstrous beings. It reflects the deep structures of the soul itself. When humanity first shaped its myths, it was not inventing fables for entertainment, but giving voice to experiences that could not otherwise be expressed. Myth is, in truth, a mirror in which we may perceive the inner life, not in fragments, but in the vast forms that unite personal experience with collective truth. Every myth we inherit carries the weight of psychic reality. The tale of the hero who sets forth to slay the dragon is not simply a record of some archaic adventure. It is the drama of every human life confronted with fear, chaos, and the unknown. The dragon is the shadow that guards the treasure of transformation. The hero's journey is the movement of the psyche toward wholeness. Likewise, myths of death and rebirth do not merely describe the cycle of nature. They echo the psyche's own rhythm of dissolution and renewal, the endless pattern of endings that become beginnings. In this way, myth does not stand outside of us. It is our own story, projected into grand symbolic forms, so that we may see more clearly the forces at play within us. To gaze into myth is to gaze into the unconscious. For within us lies a domain of images not born from personal memory, but from the collective inheritance of humankind. These images press upward, demanding expression, and in myth they find shape. That is why myths of distant cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, often display uncanny similarity. The same motifs recur: the trickster who mocks authority, the virgin who gives birth to a savior, the flood that sweeps away corruption, the descent into the underworld. They are not the property of one people, but of the human soul itself. When we read them, we are not merely learning about others, we are encountering ourselves. The modern mind, in its hunger for rational clarity, often dismisses myth as obsolete, as though enlightenment requires us to cast off these ancient tales. Yet even as we claim to be rid of them, they reappear in disguise. We find them in our literature, in our cinema, in the collective ideals and fears that shape nations and cultures. The archetypal drama will not be silenced, for it arises from depths beyond our control. The myth lives on, not because we consciously choose it, but because the psyche requires it as a means of orientation and meaning. Without myth, we risk losing the thread that ties the conscious ego to the unconscious depths. When one engages with myth sincerely, one does not merely interpret old tales, one undergoes a transformation. To recognize in Persephone's descent to Hades the experience of one's own depression or grief is to realize that suffering is not meaningless, but a stage in a larger cycle that includes return and renewal. To see in Prometheus the restless striving of the human spirit, which suffers for its gifts of fire and knowledge, is to grasp something of one's own creative burden. In myth, the individual recognizes the universality of personal struggle, and thus finds both consolation and guidance. The tale becomes a mirror in which the inner life is revealed, not as chaos, but as part of a larger, eternal pattern. The encounter with myth is not merely intellectual. It stirs the heart with awe and dread, for in its symbols dwell numinous powers. When a myth truly speaks, it awakens within us forces that are at once familiar and strange, intimate and vast. It is as though one were touched by something beyond the personal, something both human and divine. This is the moment when the mirror of myth shows us not only who we are, but what we might become. It is a profound mistake to regard myth as a relic of primitive thought. Rather, it is a living bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, between the finite individual and the infinite depths. In attending to myth, we listen to the whisper of the collective unconscious as it takes shape in story. We learn to see our desires, our fears, our conflicts, not as isolated accidents, but as parts of an ancient human drama. And in this recognition, the burden of life becomes more bearable, for one realizes that one is not alone in one's struggle. The myths assure us that others have walked this path, that the way has been trodden, that meaning lies hidden in the very patterns of our trials. Thus, when we read myth or dream myth or see it rise in art and ritual, we are not spectators but participants. The mirror does not merely reflect an image, it gazes back at us, demanding that we acknowledge what lies within. To ignore it is to turn away from our own depths. To embrace it is to enter into dialogue with the eternal forces that shape our lives. Myth, then, is not illusion, but revelation. It is the psyche itself, speaking in its most ancient and enduring tongue. To speak of the gods is to speak of ourselves, not the shallow self we parade in daily life, but the deeper self that stretches beyond the limits of consciousness. If we dare to look into these ancient images, we do not merely study the past, we hold a mirror to our own inner life, and in that mirror we may begin to see not only what we are, but what we might yet become. The movement toward wholeness does not proceed only through rational insight or conscious intention. It is often awakened by encounters with figures that seem greater than ourselves, figures clothed in mystery, terror, and fascination. These encounters, which once appeared in myth as meetings with gods and goddesses, remain alive in the depths of the psyche. They come to us in dreams, in visions, in sudden moods that seize the soul. They are divine not in the sense of external deities commanding worship, but in their overwhelming power and their numinous character. To meet such forces is to be drawn into the process of transformation that leads toward individuation. The psyche contains patterns older than any individual life, forms that emerge spontaneously when the human spirit confronts the mysteries of existence. These forms carry an authority that cannot be explained away by reason. They are experienced as presences, wise, terrifying, alluring, or commanding. In the ancient world they were named as gods, the mother who nourishes, the father who commands, the trickster who unsettles, the destroyer who clears the path for renewal. In modern times they may appear in the theatre of the dream as archetypal figures, or they may seize us in moments of profound inspiration or despair. To encounter them is to come face to face with something greater than the conscious ego. Individuation demands that we do not flee from these encounters, but engage them with humility and courage. The ego, with its narrow concerns, is easily overwhelmed by these figures. It is tempted either to inflate itself, believing it has become identical with the god, or to repress them entirely, dismissing their reality as mere fantasy. Both paths lead to imbalance and distortion. True growth requires dialogue. One must recognize the autonomy of these inner presences, acknowledge their meaning, and integrate their energy into the wider structure of the self. In this way, the individual is not consumed, but transformed. Consider the figure of the shadow, often experienced as a dark and threatening presence. To meet the shadow is to encounter the denied aspects of one's own being, the impulses, desires, and qualities that the conscious self rejects. It may appear as a monstrous figure in a dream or as a hated enemy in waking life. To flee from it is to remain divided, enslaved by what one refuses to acknowledge. To turn toward it, however, is to recover lost vitality and to take the first step toward wholeness. The shadow, once integrated, ceases to be merely destructive. It becomes the ground upon which greater life may grow. Beyond the shadow lies the anima or animus, the inner image of the opposite sex. This figure often appears with irresistible fascination or overwhelming authority, and it represents the bridge to deeper layers of the unconscious. The encounter with this figure may be intoxicating, even dangerous, for it has the power to possess the ego and distort reality. Yet if approached with discernment, it becomes a guide toward the inner world, a mediator that leads the individual toward the experience of the self. Here again, the divine quality of the encounter is unmistakable. One feels seized by something both deeply personal and entirely beyond oneself. In the culmination of this process stands the self, the archetype of wholeness, often experienced in symbolic form, as a radiant figure, a divine child, a wise elder, or a mandala of completeness. To encounter the self is to confront the center and totality of the psyche, a presence that transcends the ego. This is the true goal of individuation, the realization that the ego is not the master of the house, but a servant of a larger reality. The divine encounter here is not external worship, but inner alignment. One discovers a meaning that surpasses personal ambition, a sense of harmony that unites opposites and brings the fragments of life into coherence. The path towards such encounters is never without danger. To meet the gods of the psyche is to risk disorientation, to be shaken from the familiar certainties of the conscious world. Yet it is also the only path by which the soul can grow. Without these encounters, life remains shallow, trapped within the confines of convention and persona. With them, life opens into depth, into meaning, into the possibility of transformation. Thus, individuation is not a solitary act of the ego, but a dialogue with the eternal powers that dwell within. Each divine encounter is a threshold, a challenge, and an invitation. To accept the invitation is to walk the path of integration, to embrace the fullness of one's being, and to discover the mystery of the self. In this way, what once appeared as gods outside us reveals itself as the living reality within us, guiding us toward wholeness. The journey inward eventually confronts us with a paradox, that what we have called gods, archetypes, or numinous figures are at once deeply within us and beyond us. They possess autonomy as if they were beings independent of our will, yet they are also intimate, woven into the very fabric of the soul. To live meaningfully, one must reconcile this paradox, uniting the inner divine with the conscious self. Without such reconciliation, life is divided, torn between the demands of the ego and the overwhelming presence of unconscious powers. With reconciliation, there arises a deeper harmony, a sense of belonging both to oneself and to something greater. This reconciliation does not mean domination. The ego cannot hope to subdue the inner gods, nor should it attempt such conquest. Whenever the conscious mind seeks to suppress or deny these powers, they reappear in distorted forms of obsessive desires, destructive compulsions, collective delusions. To live as though one were independent of the inner divine is to court fragmentation and neurosis. On the other hand, surrendering entirely to these forces leads to possession, where the individual is swept away by archetypal energies. losing the thread of personal existence. The task is neither repression nor abandonment, but dialogue and balance. In every genuine encounter with the unconscious, one senses both strangeness and familiarity. A figure may appear in a dream, robed in the majesty of divinity, yet when contemplated deeply, it reveals aspects of the dreamer's own soul. The godlike quality reflects its archetypal root, but its specific form mirrors the personal life of the individual. The reconciliation lies in holding both truths simultaneously, recognizing the image as an eternal pattern, and at the same time acknowledging it as a living part of one's own psyche. To do this is to integrate, to weave the divine into the personal, so that it no longer stands as alien, but as kin. Symbols serve as bridges in this work. A mandala, a sacred child, a radiant light. Such images unite opposites and express the possibility of wholeness. They arise unbidden from the unconscious at moments of great tension, when the psyche seeks balance. The ego, if it is wise, does not dismiss these images as fantasy, but honors them as messages from the depths. In engaging with them, the individual begins to feel the presence of the self, that central archetype which embraces both the divine and the human. Here lies the heart of reconciliation, the realization that the personal self is contained within a larger transpersonal whole. The path is not without struggle. Often the divine appears first in terrifying form, demanding sacrifice, threatening dissolution. The ego resists, fearing loss of autonomy, yet if one endures the encounter, a transformation occurs. The terrifying God becomes a guiding presence. The overwhelming power reveals itself as the very ground of meaning. What was once alien becomes the deepest part of oneself. This is not the annihilation of individuality, but its fulfillment. The personal self is no longer isolated, no longer a fragment cut off from its source, but part of a living totality. Such reconciliation has profound ethical significance. When the inner divine is denied, it often erupts unconsciously in collective forms: fanaticism, idolization of leaders, blind obedience to ideologies. People project the God within onto external figures, surrendering their freedom and responsibility. But when reconciliation occurs within the individual, the projection is withdrawn. One no longer seeks salvation in outer idols, but recognizes the source of meaning within. This does not lead to isolation, but to a deeper connection with others, for one perceives that the same divine core lives in every human being. The fruits of reconciliation are a sense of inner harmony, a life lived with meaning, and the ability to embrace opposites without being torn apart by them. Joy and sorrow, creation and destruction, love and conflict, all are seen as aspects of a larger whole. The individual who has reconciled with the inner divine does not escape suffering, but bears it with dignity, for suffering itself is understood as part of the process by which the soul grows. Ultimately, reconciliation is a mystery. It cannot be forced by will alone. It comes as grace, as a gift from the depths. Yet it requires the readiness of the ego, the willingness to listen, to endure, and to surrender its illusions of supremacy. When this readiness meets the power of the unconscious, the union becomes possible. The divine within and the personal self are no longer at odds, but recognized as two aspects of one reality. In this union lies the possibility of becoming whole, of living not as a fragment torn between competing forces, but as an integrated being in whom the eternal speaks through the human.